So good morning, everyone. We're going to get started now. Welcome. Welcome to this symposium on postal banking. I see that people are putting their headsets on, so for interpretation in English, it's channel 1.
Canal 2.
And channel 2 in French. And if you wish to listen to the floor, it's 0. So once again, welcome to this CUPW Symposium on Postal Banking. We're here to share all our models for success around the world. So welcome. Welcome to all the participants who are here in the room with us. And of course, we have speakers lined up for you today who've traveled here and who are probably tired from their travels. We also have representatives from various unions who are with us, from across the country and the United States, and various parts of the world, such as England, France, Italy, New Zealand, and Australia. So a number of countries are represented here to talk about postal banking. And we also have members and representatives of the political parties with us. And of course, they're very interested in this new approach involving postal banking. And we have members as well who are here and who represent citizens groups, lawyers, and many others. So welcome to all of you to this symposium. We are convinced that we have put together an agenda that will meet your expectations and that will probably provoke a lot of debate in the room. And we're trying to see how we can bring in postal banking services here in Canada. So welcome, but welcome as well to our sisters and brothers and our friends who are watching us streaming live today, because through today's modern technology, we are able to speak to people around the globe. And when we organize a conference such as this with live streaming, we are able to allow others to participate. And that's exactly what we want to have happen. We want people here in Canada to hear from the speakers as well, and for them to have a chance to present their viewpoints and ask their questions of all our speakers, and really fully participate in the debate. So I want to welcome all of them. And of course, in that area, there is a policy that we have for the people who are available in this room, because as you know, there are cameras around the room, and there is a note that you should read here. We would like to inform you that the activities of this symposium are being streamed live via audio and video over the internet, and that they're also being recorded. We expect to use these recordings for educational and promotional purposes. It is also possible that the video be made available on the internet via DVD. And if you have any questions or concerns or comments about this, please address your comments to Gail Bossenberry, Vice President, or to myself before the end of the symposium. So we want to thank you very much for your cooperation. As you see, there are microphones on every table, which will allow you to participate fully in this extensive debate we'll be having today. So welcome again, and as you see, we have sign language interpretation in Langage des Signes du Québec and ASL for all those members who are hard of hearing or deaf, so that they can also follow the debate and understand what's being said in the presentations. And of course, the presentations are all on our website. Anything that's available in PowerPoint. So if that's the case, you can view them or share those presentations with others. And the majority of those presentations are in English and in French, so you can access them on both screens. So this is the context in which we are organizing this symposium, and we're extremely pleased to have you here with us today, because, of course, the question of the future of postal banking or postal services in Canada and around the globe is a common concern and a concern for all workers. And here in Canada, our union, for some 50 years actually, has had as its main struggle or its main objective to maintain postal services that are public and universal. And I believe that that is the major challenge that we have met and that we've been able to meet thus far. But in order to really be able to develop that perspective and keep it moving forward, we have to develop a real vision of postal services that are public and universal, because, as you know, with technological change and new electronic change, certainly a postal service, letter mail is declining. There are other services that are coming forward, such as e-commerce and parcels, which are picking up some of the slack. But at the same time, we know that in the current political and economic context, governments and corporations such as Canada Post have a different vision of the future. Their vision is more to say, well, we'll keep the corporation going, we'll remain profitable, and so on, but not by extending services. Instead, what they want to do is cut services to the public, which by its very nature has the impact of cutting jobs and also creating jobs with worse salaries. There are fewer jobs necessarily, and of course pensions are also affected by this. So I think that's the reality that we're seeing around the world at this time with respect to postal services. When you talk about postal services now, you're talking about a global phenomenon, and of course all the unions and all the groups that are affected by this are leading the same struggle. What can we do to maintain public universal postal services? And for us, it means expanding services. And that's the reason why we're very, very pleased to have this debate on postal banking, because we know that postal banking has seen a great deal of success in various regions of the world. So it's important for the Canadian public to hear about this. And we're going to start, well, actually, we began talking about it several years ago, because this is part of our vision for expansion of services, particularly through self-sufficient corporation. And one of our goals is for the corporation to become economically stronger. So as part of this symposium, we will be looking at how postal banking can become a winning solution that would allow us to save public postal services. We still have that vision that involves protecting public postal services. And now I'd like to invite our sister Brenda McAuley,
Canadian Postmaster and Assistant Association, and she will give a little notes and words of greeting. Brenda?
Good morning, everyone. Canadian Postmasters and Assistants Association, CPAA, would like to thank Denis Lemelin and all of the CUPW executive for putting together this banking symposium and extending the invitation to CPAA. More than ever, it is important that unions come together with our common goal to help sustain our public post offices and maintain good-paying jobs with benefits for our members. CPAA is the bargaining unit that represents over 10,000 members that work in 3,337 post offices across Canada. Canada Post has the infrastructure set up to allow financial services in our post offices. We conducted a survey across Canada and asked Canadians, and they told us that they want financial services in their post offices. Not only do they want them, they need them. My 86-year-old mother travels 26 kilometers by bus to go to her bank. In just one of our 8 provinces, we have over 60 communities that do not have financial services. With a high percentage of seniors living in rural communities, they should be respected and not have to travel out of their communities for post office or financial services. We have over 100 years of history to preserve, and this is a critical time in history for all of us. We have lost over 1,700 CPAA post offices since the 80s, and we cannot lose any more. Therefore, CPAA would like to thank all the guest speakers and international guests for sharing their expertise and time on this issue. I hope everyone has a great 2 days, and for our out-of-country guests, I hope you brought some warm clothes. Thank you. Bye.
So thank you, Brenda, for your kind words. So we are all together here, and all the union that fighting to protect the postal service. We are on the same page around the issue of banking. So now I will invite you to take your kits. I will just go through a little bit to do what's in it. So you have primary, you have your agenda. So, and we try to have all the speakers who are from other countries that we invited to have the possibility to address. So today we'll work, this morning will be more around putting a global picture around what's happening in the banking and what's happening here in Canada around the postal service. And after that, we will have different presentation around what's happening in other part of the world. And I think that's really, really important. So all our guests will come here and share with us their view about the postal service and the postal bank and how it's happening in their own country. And after that, we have some idea about what's happening in the States and mapping about where are the banks and the postal service in this country. And Sunday, we will continue. But Sunday, too, we will have a panel to look at the social impact of postal banking, because that's something important when we're talking about postal banking. There's a big impact around the social aspect of it. It's a bank, but it's a bank who can be really a bank to serve the citizen of the country. So it's a postal bank, but we know at the same time, and we'll see the experience out there, it can be, and it is, a social bank at the same time. So that's what you have, and you have at the same time in the kit the presentation or the research or the study of John Anderson, Why Canada Needs Postal Banking. And around that, you have two research who have been done by Cathy Stanoff and Jeff Bickerton, who are our researcher around the issue that we call Banking on a Future for Post, a financial assessment of postal banking and financial services at various postal administration. So that's what you have, and you have some other information about banking, a fact sheet around banking. So that's our agenda for our 2 days of discussion, and we're sure we will really have a good discussion during these days. So just before we start, so I have something to share with you, because last year we had a poll out there by Stratcom talking about the Postal Service and how people were seeing banking. And there was a lot of people were saying about banking and services is really good. It's really good for us. It's really good for the public and for this society. So April 9 and 10, we do it again. We had a poll, and now we can say that close to 2/3 of Canadians support postal banking according to that poll. So that's something really important because everybody saw what happened since last year, since last December, when the government announced his the government in Canada Post, I think they are all together on that, when they announced their 5-point plan, talking about the issue of the fact that they will eliminate door-to-door, they will raise the price of the stamp and all of that, and they went out saying that it's really something that they have to do because they will lose money and they have to cut. So it's really good to see that 6 months later, the people of this country still believe. So the poll was conducted by Stratcom, April 9 and 10, and it found that 63.5% of respondents supported Canada Post expanding revenue-generating services, including financial services like bill payments, insurance, and banking. Canada Post could follow the lead of post office in other countries by leveraging its network and adding lucrative banking services. There is support for this move, and there are options other than cutting. So that's really good. That's a way to start this banking symposium. So now we will start. Donc, on va commencer.
We're going to get started now. And clearly this morning, and as I was saying, well, if you look at the agenda now, you will see that we have 3 people up at the front. Linda McQuaig will begin. Then John Anderson from CCPA will follow. And he will be talking about the study he carried out on banks here. And then Simon Tremblay-Pépin from IRIS will be addressing the topic of what is happening in Quebec in particular and the issue of privatization.
First 2 speakers will speak, will do the presentation, and after that we will have a round of discussion. A first round of discussion that people can ask questions, that people on the live streaming will have the possibility to ask questions and all of that. So 2 speakers, we will have a round, and after that we will have a 3rd speaker explaining about privatization, and after that we will have another round of discussion to have really have a good view about what's happening and really share our view around postal services. So I will introduce the 2 first speakers. So the first speaker is Linda McQuaig. The people in Canada know her for a long time. Linda is one of the foremost progressive economics thinkers and writers in Canada. She has a long list of accomplishments, and I will only name a few. Winner of a National Newspaper Award. She has been a reporter for the Globe and Mail, a columnist for the National Post and the Toronto Star. She is author of 7 bestsellers, including Shooting the Hippo, Debt by Deficit and Other Canadian Myth, and it's The Crude, Dude, War, Big Oil, and the Fight for the Planet. Her most recent book is The Trouble with Billionaires, How the Super Rich Hijack the World, and How We Can Take It Back. So, and we know Linda us in CUPW for a long time because we have what we call a union education program. And we use some of his ideas in our book and some of her video around oil and all of that to share and have discussion with our members. So she's known by our members for a long time because she is part of our education program. Her views are known by our brothers and sisters. So welcome, Linda. So welcome to do your presentation.
Thank you very much, Denis, and bonjour.
Hi, thank you very much.
And I just want to say how really delighted I am to be here today. You know, I was trying to explain to my daughter why I was excited to come to this symposium today. She heard the title, Postal Banking, and she didn't quite get it. Didn't find it all that exciting. But the truth is, I would argue, and I tried to explain to her, and I think it will become evident as the day goes on, that the concept of postal banking may sound a little dull, but in fact gets into some fascinating issues, and in fact, I would argue, is something that will become key to a progressive agenda in Canada. You know, for the past 20, 30 years, we've seen the right, the Conservatives, the right, and the business community push so hard with their agenda. It's always about, you know, dismantling our public systems. I mean, essentially what they seem to want is to return us to a situation where, you know, we're nothing but individuals out there in the marketplace, nothing but consumers, to take away our role as citizens and to destroy the kind of strong public systems that we've built in this country. And sadly, they've had quite a bit of success in that direction. And what they essentially want to do is destroy that notion that collectively we can do things better than we can do individually, and that's essentially part of being a country. And postal banking, I would argue, is a very exciting element in that direction. It strengthens, has the potential to strengthen our public institutions and provide vital services for Canadians, strengthening our postal service, which is so important in terms of connecting Canadians in this huge country, and giving Canadians potential access to a new public, an entirely new public system in the area of banking. And when you start to think of that, you start to see why the Harper Conservatives have been so quick to kill this idea. It's in fact a very powerful idea. Now I want to put the whole idea in a little bit of a political context, and Denis did this a few minutes ago, and note that, you know, we had last December, kind of out of the blue in the eyes of most Canadians, there was this startling declaration that essentially the post office, as we know it, would be pretty much, you know, cutting off really what most Canadians consider its major feature, its door-to-door delivery. And we were told, you know, there'd be these drastic cuts in services, drastic hikes at the same time in postal rates. I think they went up something like 60%. And of course, we were told, as we're always told in these kind of situations where there's these significant cutbacks, no choice, right? We simply didn't have an option. And of course, they, you know, pointed to the rise of the internet and email and social media and everything. People just aren't sending letters in the way they used to, which is true enough. But what they didn't tell us, and of course the media basically went along with the story, you know, there's no there's no choice. We have to kind of go in this direction. You know, Canada Post is struggling financially, even though, and I think John will get into this more, in fact, Canada Post has not overall been struggling financially. But basically, the media bought the argument there was no choice but to do these cutbacks. It kind of reminded me of what happened when the Conservatives a few years earlier had announced that they were going to raise the age of retirement from 65 to 67, just a huge change in a basic public system for Canada. And they did it on the argument that we couldn't afford anything else. In fact, I recall Kevin Page, the parliamentary budget officer at the time, saying that their math was just plain wrong, that in fact we could afford to keep the system we had. But again, as in this situation, the media picked up on the government's arguments and, apart from a few articles here and there, basically regurgitated the argument, this is the future, you know, now we have the internet, now Canadians are living longer. We don't need these strong public systems like we used to have them. But what we now know, and John will get into this more in his presentation, what we now know is that, in fact, there was another option. In fact, there was an option that had been building inside Canada Post itself. Yes, Canada Post fell in line with what the government wanted, but in fact they had been building a case for some time that in fact there was another option, and that option was postal banking. And in fact, as John will get into, there was massive research around this, and as was described in one of the studies, postal banking would amount to what they called a win-win strategy, in the sense that it would strengthen the post office and its finances, and also give Canadians service in an area that they didn't have before. But the government simply rejected this win-win option and instead went with a lose-lose option. You know, the cutting back in services and cutting back in or at least raising prices. And ostensibly, we were told, or to the extent that this came up in the few articles that kind of dealt with this, the fact that there was another option, because there was a leak, basically, of some of these important documents. But the story really went nowhere in the media. Ostensibly, the argument, to the extent it was addressed at all, was, well, we have such a great banking system in Canada. We already have a terrific banking system. Why would we need the post office to get into banking? And this is what I want to address today, this question about, do we need postal banking, because are we properly served by our banks? And I'm going to argue we are not properly served by our banks sufficiently in key areas that, in fact, the post office could step into. Let me just say that, you know, few myths are more carefully nurtured by the elite and by the government in this country than the notion that we are well served in Canada by our banks. You know, in the Harper government rarely misses an opportunity to talk about how fantastic Canadian banks are, and constantly pointing out that in the 2008 financial crisis, you know, we never would have gotten through it had it not been for Canada's banks. And let me just quickly acknowledge that it is true that Canada's banks held up better than, you know, the casino banks on Wall Street. That's absolutely true. And that was important in keeping Canada from the depths of recession that they experience in the United States. We, of course, have had recession, serious recession here in Canada, but not to the depths of the Americans. So the point is, yes, the Canadian banking system did hold up well in that way. But I would argue in a completely different way, it underserves Canadians. We are underserved by our banks. And you know, once you get beyond the Harper government and the business and banking community, I think you would find out there that most Canadians, almost all Canadians, when asked about the banks in Canada, would argue that they're, oversized monster organizations that are poor in the service they provide and gouging with their fees and their interest rates. I don't think you'd get a lot of debate over that. So I just want to give you a bit of an overview of the banking sector in Canada. We, of course, have 5, or sometimes you could consider it 6 major banks in Canada. They're household names. We all know them: Royal Bank, Scotiabank, Bank of Montreal, TD Bank, what have I left out? BMO, and the National Bank of Canada. These are some of the wealthiest and most profitable, thank you, Damon, wealthiest and most profitable corporations in Canada. In fact, their most recent profit reports are collectively between the 6 banks. They had over $30 billion in profits. And that represents actually a 17% rate of return. In fact, some numbers, John just gave me a chart showing me that may understate things. The profit margins for the banks, and if you go back historically over the past 10 years, tend to have been between 20 and 30%. I mean, that's just an enormous rate of return, if you compare that to other segments of the Canadian economy. So the banks are in this enormously profitable, really privileged position in the Canadian economy. And this has been the case for 140 years since the Bank Act was created in the 1870s. These big banks have been the dominant force in the Canadian economy. They've lied at the very heart of the Canadian establishment. And what they essentially are, you can describe them as a regulated monopoly. And I see some people looking for some chairs. You found some? Okay. Yeah, I think we had reserved some front row seats for the Harper cabinet, but oddly, I guess they were busy with other things. What we have essentially is a regulated monopoly in Canada. And a regulated oligopoly is probably the better way to put it. But what I mean by that, oligopoly in the sense that it's a monopoly, but it's shared among a small number of players. So it's a monopoly of 6, a monopoly of 5 or 6. But it's it's a government-run, government-monitored, government-controlled monopoly in the sense that there's a complex set of rules that govern it. So banks must have a charter. You can't just decide you're going to set up a bank. You have to get a charter in Canada. And you have to follow a whole complex set of rules. There have to be a certain amount of capital requirements, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the important rules is that the rules regulating Canadian banks limit the entry of players, like limit, in terms of you need a charter, and also limit foreign competition. They essentially prevent foreign competitors from coming in, except for really the really sort of niche market for the very wealthy. And they limit the amount that any one interest can have in a bank. So, it's kind of, you can't have corporate takeovers, and you can't have foreign companies come in and taking over banks. So they're in this very privileged position. It's kind of, the way to look at it is they've got the benefits of a regulated situation that protects their interests and their privileged position and prevents newcomers from coming in and competing against them. In exchange, they're regulated in ways to make sure that they don't collapse, and that reflects the way that we saw in the 2008 financial crash, that they did not, in fact, collapse. So the result of this is that, in fact, we have had a fair bit of financial, or really a lot of financial stability in this country. In fact, even in the 1930s, when banks were going under, so heavily, you know, in the United States. We had very little in the way of bank failure here in Canada. Same thing in 2008. In fact, there's been very little bank failure in general throughout our banking history. But the flip side of that, of all that stability, has been the extreme concentration that we find in our banking sector. And, you know, if you look back historically, the period from after the Second World War till about the 80s or 90s, you could regard that as sort of the quiet period in banking. It's sometimes known as the 363 period. And that was, you know, when banks borrowed at 3%, lent money out at 6%, and bank executives hit the golf course by 3 o'clock. And back then, you know, there was 8,000 bank branches in the country. Like, you know, virtually every town, every community had one, if not two, banks right at their corner. So even though it was a kind of oligopoly situation, you could argue that in some ways Canadians were fairly well served by this situation. And actually, if you go back then, believe it or not, there were no fees on banking in Canada. Basically, the banks paid, you know, they covered their costs out of the money, you know, lending out the money at 6%, and they considered that adequate. Now, basically what happened is, you know, in the era of hyper-globalization starting in the 80s and 90s, banks wanted to become even more hyper-profitable. And of course, one of the things they did was they tried to merge. There was the big controversy in the late 1990s when 4 of the 5 major banks wanted to become 3 banks. And that was a huge controversy. Basically, the business community was very favorable towards it. The argument was, you know, these banks had to merge so that they could become globally competitive. Wasn't quite clear why that was necessary for Canadians, but the business community bought that. At the same time, there was huge public anger because it was assumed that part of the merger was about closing bank branches across the country. And if there's one thing Canadians care about in terms of banking, it's having access to a local bank branch. And there had already been considerable closings by the late 90s, but it was feared that the situation would become worse under a merger. So politically, what ended up happening, of course, was that Paul Martin, who was then the finance minister, absolutely realized that, and of course we all know the one thing Paul Martin wanted was to be prime minister, and that he would never be prime minister if he approved the merger. So he turned it down. And that was good that he turned that down. But the striking thing is that even though he prevented that merger, and we now still have essentially 5 or you could say 6 major banks, we haven't gotten the benefits of the turning down the merger. If anything, what's happened is that the banking sector's become even more concentrated since the merger was turned down. In fact, there was an IMF study that came out just this month that showed, and it's striking again that this got so little attention in Canada. It identified the Canadian banking sector as one of the most concentrated in the world. Like, in other words, one of the least competitive banking sectors in the world. In fact, like, it was comparing banks in Europe, North America, or emerging markets, and it found, of all those banks they looked at, all the countries with the banking sectors, Canada was one of only 3 that had what they considered the highest level of concentration, and that was where the 3 biggest banks controlled more than 60% of all the banking assets. So in other words, Canada, and the other 2 countries, if you're interested, were France and Spain. Canada is one of the most concentrated banking sectors in the world, and therefore one of the least competitive. And what the IMF study went on to point out was that, in fact, it's getting more concentrated all the time. You could see in their chart that rather than, the turn down of the merger sort of opening things up and becoming more competitive, in fact, the banking sector gets more and more concentrated all the time. And the study also points out that, Canada's banks, like big banks, too big to fail banks as they're called in other parts of the world, they enjoy an enormous public subsidy in the sense that because they are so big and because it's implicit that governments would bail them out because of their bigness should they fail, they can borrow money at a much lower rate. So this increased their profit margins. The study said that for the U.S., for instance, that amounts to a $50 billion subsidy a year to their banks. Unfortunately, they didn't give a breakdown for what it would be in Canada, but sizable. So in other words, the Canadian banks don't really compete that much in the Canadian markets. They've essentially got their shares divided up, and they don't really compete with each other. What they have been interested in recent years in doing is expanding into foreign markets. So what they're doing essentially is they're taking the enormous wealth that they've built up by, through their profits managing the money of Canadians and using that to expand overseas. We've seen them, do enormous takeovers and expansions into the U.S., Latin America, Europe, and Asia. In fact, now, if you look at the rankings for the top 100 global banks in the world, you find that all 5 of the biggest Canadian banks are on them. So these Canadian banks have become substantial players. Despite not being able to merge, they've become enormous behemoths anyway. Domestically, what they've been doing increasingly is diversifying into wealth management, right? Into the management of rich people's money. Because, of course, as we all know, what's been going on in recent years is that more and more money is being transferred to people at the very top. And so this is the target audience, if you want to put it. This is the group that the banks continue to be interested in Canada. They are showing interest, or they have shown an interest in abandoning ordinary Canadians, lower down the income scale. And they do this by, of course, one of the key ways that they have been increasing their profit margins in Canada is not by finding new customers, just the opposite, shutting down branches, but by cutting their costs, right? So it's that cost-cutting model. They've closed 1,700 bank branches across the country in the last 25 years, which, like I was mentioning at the beginning, at one point they had 8,000 bank branches. Now they're down to 6,205 branches across the country, a drop of 22%. And it's not just sort of across the board. They're particularly, if you want to put it, targeting the poor and the lower middle class or whatever, and even the middle class, as they focus increasingly on wealth management. For instance, in Winnipeg, in the poorest part of Winnipeg, there's been 9 bank branches closed. In most poor communities, you can't even find a bank branch anymore. Whereas I noticed, I checked out a little strip in Toronto the other day that borders on Rosedale, which is, of course, a swanky part of Toronto, where in fact most of the bank managers, bank CEOs live. And by the way, I forgot to mention bank CEOs when I was talking about how profitable these companies are. All 6 of the bank CEOs in Canada are in the top 20 in terms of CEO bank pay for North America. So we take good care of our bank presidents here, and they end up living in lavish mansions in Rosedale. And they make sure that Rosedale is well served by banks. So for instance, on this little strip of expensive stores right adjacent to Rosedale, you know, there's a TD Bank right on the corner that hasn't been closed down. And I noticed a new bank. Well, branches are being shut down all over the country. In Rosedale, the Royal Bank has opened up a new branch. So this business of shutting down branches is very uneven. And in fact, we know that there's hundreds of communities. I think John has a number showing possibly as many as 2,000 communities, maybe without a bank at all. It's hard to get these statistics. We know that there's 380 communities that where banks have shut down, and they have credit unions, in their place. But in many communities beyond that, so there's no bank branches in those 380s, and in hundreds of other communities, we know that they have neither a credit union nor a bank. And again, it's targeted. It's for instance, First Nations communities, 615 across the country, only 54 branches serving them. So obviously that is just a terrible, terrible situation on these First Nations communities. I mean, think of it in terms of, let's say, somebody wanting to set up a business. How can you set up a business if you don't, if you don't have a bank branch to draw on, to deposit and to get loans from? Brenda was telling that story about her mother having to drive, 26 kilometers? And this is another thing, that the shutting down of the bank branches is so serious to seniors, to people with disabilities, having to go long distances to do your basic banking. And in fact, there's an interesting quote from a Price Waterhouse study from last year that is describing sort of banking strategy, and it pointed out in high net worth areas where customers are very digitally savvy, and I think they might have also added where they have a lot of money, branches may focus on delivering financial advice and helping customers with major financial transactions such as mortgages. In other words, in high net worth areas, we will maintain good banking services. Then it goes on to say, for the rest of the country, ATMs and kiosks may suffice. You can see that sort of incredibly dismissive attitude. So as a result of that, there are we don't even know the numbers, but hundreds of thousands of what are called unbanked people, people without access to a bank account, without access to basic banking services. One estimate, and this is considered very conservative, put it at about 900,000 Canadians, are basically unbanked, or you can be underbanked, have access to a bank that's, fairly far away, hard to get to, that kind of thing, or has minimal services. Now, what this has done is it's created this huge community out there, hundreds of thousands, possibly more than that, possibly over 1 million people, who are really, they need banking services. And they're really prey for these, for a new feature that's come on the banking landscape, these payday lenders, Money Mart and Wonga and Zippy and, a whole bunch of these poorly regulated, because it's up to the provinces to regulate these kind of financial, kind of fringe operations. And they're very poorly regulated, and they're allowed to charge extremely high interest rates. So, for instance, people that are desperate for banking services, desperate to get perhaps a government check cashed, and have a short-term loan, for 2 or 3 weeks. They are forced to pay just exorbitant, really usurious rates of interest. There was a BC study showing that the rates charged and the rates allowed to be charged by these fringe operations in BC, an average loan, one of these payday loans, is $280 for 10 days at a cost of $64, which amounts to an annualized rate of interest of 839%, which is obviously ridiculous. So again, what this does is I think it shows how people are desperately underserved and to the point that lots of people are using these services. Now, Money Mart is a huge growing business. In fact, Money Mart, an American company, reports its highest profit levels in Canada. And again, I ask the question, we want to encourage supposedly entrepreneurialism. How do we encourage entrepreneurialism if we don't give people the basic tools they need to set up a business? And nothing could be more basic to setting up some kind of small business than having access to a bank. So I would argue that the Canadian system, this widely celebrated Canadian system, which is always so heartily praised by our political and business leaders, is really malfunctioning in some key ways. There's essentially no pressure on the banks to serve Canadians in a significant capacity. There's essentially no provision to encourage competition. Our fees, it turns out, are among the highest in the world. Our banking fees, typically about $185 per Canadian, which is not surprising. In fact, it's obvious. If you have no competition, you're going to have extremely bad consumer results. So having some of the highest banking rates, banking fees is just, par for the course. Whereas, don't forget, 30 years ago, we didn't even have banking fees in this country. And there's no government pressure to correct this situation. So the banks are in a wonderfully powerful situation, this at the very heart of the Canadian establishment, no pressure on them to change, to expand their services to possibly 1 million or more Canadians that are seriously underserved. In fact, the interesting thing is the argument that you hear from time to time, and you heard this at the time of the bank mergers, and I saw it even the other day, the banking writer for the Huffington Post, who's actually quite a good critic in some ways, but his argument was, he was talking about bemoaning the lack of competition in Canada and arguing, what we really need is to let foreign banks in. And this is what business always argues, like this is considered the sort of radical position or the anti-establishment position. If you don't like Canada's banking oligopoly, bring in foreign competitors, bring in, Morgan Stanley or Goldman Sachs or, what they never argue, what they never consider is, in fact, what we're going to be considering here this weekend, which is that there's a much more viable alternative that is sitting there staring us in the face. The equipment is all in place, the infrastructure is all there, but, for political reasons, they won't touch it. So if I can just take a couple more minutes, because I just wanted to quickly speculate a little bit on what the reasons are for this rejection, why the Harper government chooses lose-lose over win-win. And I guess I would just quickly say that I think we have to consider that the banks themselves probably don't want competition. They probably don't. They have this wonderful settled situation that they've had for 140 years basically, in which they are absolutely dominant. They have massive profit margins above 20%, just massive profits. Great life, And would they really want, even though they've abandoned these markets, they're happy to abandon them and just leave those people out there. But if the post office were to come in and actually start serving these markets and start showing up the banks, it would certainly destroy that whole narrative about how fabulous our banking system is. So my guess, and it also might even cut into some of their, even if you had a bank near you, I, for one, would go straight to the post office if I had an option to do that, because I love the idea of strong public systems. So my guess is the banks don't want postal banking and have made that known to people behind the scenes. And you know, the banks have a way of getting what they want. Okay, the second reason, I think, is that ideological. The Harper government, as we know, is extremely hostile to unions. It is particularly hostile to public sector unions. And it is exceptionally hostile to public sector unions that have a track record in championing the rights of ordinary workers and having a spillover effect to the labor movement in general. And of course, CUPW would fit into that last category, because all the way, you know, back to 1981 when there was the CUPW strike, which was fought over, you know, the right for paid maternity leave, and that now paid maternity leave has become a common feature in labor contracts. So CUPW has been in the sights of the Canadian government, particularly the Harper government, for a long time, and so anything that dismantles the delivery systems, I think, would be very much of interest to the Harper government. The third and last point I would make is simply the enormous hostility on the part of a lot of right-wingers in this country, you know, including the people you see in the Harper government, just to any notion of public ownership, to anything public, essentially. And you know, what we're talking about here is a system that is essentially public banking. You know, a challenge right inside this banking sector, which is, again, you know, the very heart of the Canadian establishment. You know, you see this hostility to the publics, to everything public, in, let's say, the reaction that you always get from the right about the Liquor Control Board in Ontario. The Liquor Control Board, of course, publicly owned, sells liquor in Ontario, does a very good job. It turns out you don't need to be much of an entrepreneur to sell liquor. You know, you put this stuff out and people come. And the LCBO is just enormously profitable. Last year it had, you know, $1.7 billion in profits. So every few months the right gets the idea, we should privatize it, and then just sort of some, you know, analysis is quickly done, and everybody realized, well, that'd be kind of stupid. So the truth is, the one thing that I would think would terrify the Conservatives more than anything is to have an example, to create an example of yet another kind of public system that could work very well in serving the needs of Canadians. In fact, I would argue that the case for public banking is even stronger than the case for public liquor selling. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Linda. I think it's really opening the debate around the issue of banking, and I think we share this idea that a postal bank can be really key to a really new progressive agenda in this country. It's why we are pushing it. And it's clear that since we are talking about banking, some of the main media are not really interested, because we try to have the report. There was a study made by Canada Post on banking between 2009 and 2013, and we try to have it to really see this win-win situation So I like the way you put it out, a win-win situation. We can have a postal bank to really face this big bank, but what the upper government is always a lose-lose situation. But a lose-lose situation for the workers. It's always against the workers that this government is against. So thank you to put that out. And now we'll move and have John and the son. So last year when we were looking to really look about what can be possible to do around banking in Canada, because we know the Conference Board of Canada in April 2013, they had a study out saying, banking is not the way to go. It's good for the other countries, but it's not good for us, not good for this country. It's good for the world, but not good for Canada. And we said, okay, we're pushing banking, so we have to find a way to really explain what's there, what are the possibilities, what are the different scenarios around banking and why it can be important. So we went out and tried with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternative, and we asked John Anderson to do it because John is well known. So when you look at his book or this study, you have his bio, and it's really long. He's an independent researcher and consultant, and he worked for many groups, for governments, for different political parties. He's always working around the issue how we help people to change this society. He has been involved politically all the time, so he's a great voice for the people who want a better society. And we turned to him and asked him to look at why Canada needs a postal bank. And he did, in my view, and I think the view of our board and our member, a wonderful job. So he wrote it, but not only wrote it, he defended it. He went out there in the media to explain. He wrote articles around it. He's standing for it. Each time he's invited, he is pushing the idea, and he saw that it is really something that it's important. It was a study, but I think at the same time, it's like a mission for him to go forward and push this idea. So welcome, John, to do your presentation. So can you put the PowerPoint presentation? So to go forward, there and back is there.
Okay, great,
Okay.
thank you.
And you can look at that.
Okay.
Okay, that's okay.
Merci beaucoup, Denis.
Thank you very much, Denis. I'll be speaking in English, but I'll answer questions in French.
And thank you, CUPW, for getting me to write this study, and for CCPA. It's been very, very successful. I mean, we've as of end of January, it's had 92,000 downloads on the CCPA website, which, I mean, it's not necessarily a testament to how great the study is, but what it is a testament is to the tremendous interest out there in the public in terms of this issue. That is, far more than way more than a best seller. I remember Stuart McLean, who I went to school with. Who's one of the best-selling authors. 5,000. He was telling me at one time was a bestseller in Canada, so this shows you there's an interest out there. I wanted to start off. Whoops! So I have to move along here. I wanted to start off with really a quote here, and I just wanted to know if anybody could guess who wrote this. Millions do not have a bank account or use costly services like payday loans and check cashing exchanges just to make ends meet. The entire underserved population comprises more than a quarter of all households, some millions of adults. They are an economically diverse mix of working and middle-class families, poor and unemployed people, hurt by the recent economic crisis, young people, immigrants, and others who are trying to make it paycheck to paycheck. Together, they represent a huge market. In 2012, they spent about $89 billion just on interest and fees for alternative financial services. And that's like talking about the payday loans and things like that. And interestingly enough, this was written just recently by the Inspector General of the U.S. Postal Services in a report which advocates postal banking in the U.S. So the U.S. is moving down a different track where the postal services are now advocating that the postal service in the United States take up financial services, and they are doing this publicly, and it is now being supported by, very vocally, by Senator Elizabeth Warren, who's one of the most progressive senators from Massachusetts in the U.S. So it just shows you that even our neighbors are looking at postal banking as a way of resolving some of the similar issues that they have with their postal services. So that our decision not to go down that track is really a political decision, nothing more than that, for all the reasons that Linda brought up. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but, is that Canada Post really never studied postal banking. In the report that they authorized the conference board to do, they left out financial services. They didn't do a study of financial services. They studied financial services elsewhere in the world, and there's a bit of mention of it, and they said how great it was. And then they, in fact, said that they couldn't do that here. And I'm just going to skip to what they said here, which was the conditions that allowed other postal administrations to succeed in banking do not exist in Canada. That was their quote. Now, what those conditions were, according to them, they never explained. They didn't even bother to do that because they'd been ordered not to do that. So not to look at financial services and the possibility of success. And it was that conference board report, as Denis has pointed out, was really the blueprint for the whole 5-point plan of cuts, which was in December. That was, they based themselves on that report. Got this report. Now we do the cuts because the conference board announced it. And of course, there's a very close link between the conference board and the CEO of Canada Post, who's on that report, who's on the conference board board of governors. And as we know, as Linda and Denis have mentioned, I mean, the Canada Post was doing its own research into financial services and was coming up with very different results. So let's go back to, saying this is where they've got to. They nixed it. They didn't even look at it publicly. They looked at it internally, and then have refused to publish the results of that. I've got a copy of that here, and I mean, it's just blank, mostly blank pages there with a few headlines on there. But essentially, as we do need postal banking in Canada. We've got the failure of the existing banking system to answer many the needs of groups and regions, and particularly rural Canada. And I'm working on another study for the Canadian Postmasters and Assistants Association, and rural Canada is sort of being hit with a double whammy with no banks, and then closing down post offices. So you are really attacking rural communities and by not allowing them to develop and prosper. So essentially, we need to find additional revenue for the post offices. We know that is the case. And we know also that other countries have done that. We also know that there is widespread support for postal banking in Canada. The three CEOs of Canada Post in the past have all backed postal banking, apart from the present one. The Secret Report backed postal banking. We talked about it as a win-win strategy. Opinion polls, as Denis has talked about, have consistently backed postal banking. A survey which I did recently for the Postmasters Association on rural mayors and band chiefs and reeves also backed the need for the post office to offer financial services. Now, the question is, why would it work in Canada? Well, there's a number of different reasons. I'm going to go over these very quickly, and they're really detailed much more in the report, which you've got in your kit. First of all, it works in other countries. Second of all, it's worked here in the past. And thirdly, the banking is a very profitable industry, as Linda has pointed out. You're making 20 to 30% profits. It's an industry where there is a very high profit margin, and millions of Canadians, and yet millions of Canadians are not well served by our existing banking services. And lastly, Canada Post has the workforce and infrastructure to deliver financial services. So this is a huge, it's not a question of let's create postal banking out of nothing. We have an infrastructure. We have a workforce which can deliver these services. So let's look at some of these points just a little bit more in detail. First of all, there's the success in other countries. It's a huge success around the world. Among the 100 largest banks where you have the 5 Canadian banks, there's also big postal banks like the Postal Bank of Japan, of China, and the Banque Postal de France. These are all in the 100th largest banks. So they have been very, very successful. Postal banking plays a key role in offering services which the private sector banks, and I'm sure we're going to hear about this more, do not offer. And I was particularly impressed by some of the services that were offered in countries in France with the Banque Postal, and also in New Zealand by the Kiwi Bank, which are both postal banks, and offered particular services to low-income citizens and to Aboriginal communities in the case of New Zealand. There's around 1 billion people who have banking accounts around the world, and they really do offer an alternative to the private and cooperative sector banks. So it just doesn't do it twice. Okay, so I've in there. I'm not going to go through them because we're going to hear from a lot of people about what the situation is. But certainly around the world, many of the countries which I looked at have postal banking, and the postal banking contributes a very large amount to the total profits of the banking system in these countries. So we're up to levels of 70%, and even in the UK, I was told by the head of financial services that roughly 25% of the post office revenues are coming from financial services, and that's in the non-privatized part of the post office in the UK. So there's really a huge success story out there. And obviously, there's lots of advice that Canada Post could take in terms of how to start out that. There's lots of these postal banking services which are very willing to help Canada Post. I found that out in my work. They would love to come over and give advice on how to start a postal banking service, etc. Yeah. The second point I mentioned is that we have had a success story here in the past around postal banking. This is something which most people don't know. It's amazing how this has been completely sort of taken out of the picture, that for most people don't even know about this, apart from older citizens. But for 100 years in Canada, until 1968, we had postal banking services. We had a postal savings bank. And right after Confederation, one of the first acts of Parliament was the Post Office Act, which authorized the Postal Savings Bank. And the Postal Savings Bank had great success in Canada for large parts of those 100 years. But gradually it was let to be run down, and at the same time, Canada Post and the government, Postmaster General Eric Kierans, who finally closed it down, bought into the idea that this is not part of the core operations. And of course, this was not something which Canada did on its own. The exact same time, the U.S. also shut down their postal banking services the exact same year. So clearly, there's a doctoral thesis there for potentially for some student there on that, but I would suspect that there was a lot of dialogue back and forth between the two countries and their two postal systems about why we should be shutting down postal banking services and why we shouldn't be improving them if there were problems with them at that time. Thirdly, the banking system, I'm not going to go into this, is very highly profitable and yet leaves millions of potential users out there. There's at least 2,000 communities which have no bank, and hopefully this is something which we can do in the future is to really do the kind of survey which was going to give us the exact information on how many communities do not have any form of banking. But I know, having worked in the cooperative sector with the credit unions for many years, that in many communities, credit unions there is no bank, and credit unions are the only financial institution, and that in many communities, the credit unions have told me they don't have a credit union, and they would love to see postal banking, perhaps, that they could collaborate with in order to offer some form of financial services. So the next point is that, as I mentioned, is that Canada Post has the workforce and infrastructure to deliver financial services. The first thing is that Canada Post still has a huge network of retail outlets, the largest network of any single organization across the country, bigger than any retail chain, etc. Now that's gone down from 30 years ago when I think it was around 9,000. It's gone down to 6,400, but still, this is a very, very powerful network, and we've got to bring in postal banking now before that network is further reduced, as is one of the points in that 5-point plan, is essentially to shut down more postal services. Secondly, that many of these postal services and postal outlets are in rural areas of Canada. And those are often the areas where there are worse banking services or no banking services. And so therefore this is a very positive situation that the outlets are there, because they can really help to develop postal banking in a very important way. Although I would say in Ottawa, my own neighborhood, they shut down the CIBC branch, and there's still a postal outlet inside the Shoppers, but there's no bank. So the potential there is for postal banking to be delivered in many areas, even in our big cities where there is no longer any banks. Okay. Yeah. So the other point which I wanted to make was that Canada Post is ideally suited because it still has a very high trust factor. Numerous surveys over the years have shown that, in spite of all the difficulties that Canada Post has run into, and in spite of the policies of Canada Post management in recent years, that people still trust Canada Post and its workforce, and has a high level of trust. And so therefore, this is exactly what you want when you're starting a banking services. You're starting off with an organization which people regard as a trustworthy organization. And so this is very important and a very positive point. The other thing is that Canada Post has a skilled workforce out there, a very large workforce, and I would say that when I talk to the British Post Office Vice President in charge of financial services, what he told me was that the financial services in the UK were run inside of the British Post Office, which has about double the number of outlets, by about 300 employees who concentrated on financial services. So just, I mean, the other staff, of course, were given training in financial services, but the core operations of postal banking can be run with a very small number of additional trained staff because of modern communications techniques and because of training and upgrading of existing staff. So Canada Post also already delivers a number of financial services. And certainly, as I'll say later on, one of the first steps would be to upgrade those financial services, to build on those financial services. Many post offices are open already long hours, although I see that is changing, and one of the strategies of Canada Post recently is to cut down on the hours. I know my own post office station here in Ottawa, Station E, they have now changed the hours from 8:30 in the morning to 9:30 in the morning, and only opening at 9:30 and closing at 5 instead of 5:30. Of course, it's not open on Saturday, it's not open on Sunday, but you can see that the strategy right now of Canada Post is to run down the operations of postal outlets so that therefore people can't use them. You can't go before work and you can't go after work to do your banking. On the other hand, this is something which could be turned around very, very quickly. And I remember talking to the staff there and how disappointed they were with all of the cutbacks in hours, which seemed to be totally punitive and totally aimed at reducing use of the services rather than encouraging use of the services. Lastly, in terms of when we do have a federal government which is interested in preserving and expanding postal services and sees it as part of a postal services, we can also rely on the existing financial services that the federal government has. The federal government has a lot of expertise in financial services. It has the Business Development Bank of Canada, Farm Credit Canada, and the Canada Savings Bonds operation, which are all very large financial operations with a lot of expertise. They make huge loans, Farm Credit Canada and the Business Development Bank of Canada, all across the country. And there's also Export Development Bank. So there's a huge network of financial services out there which the federal government has and has the expertise in there which could be used to help develop postal banking at the federal level. So I think that it's not something where we don't have the resources, we don't know anything. I mean, one of the things that Deepak Chopra, the CEO of Canada Post, has said, we don't know anything about financial services. Well, maybe he doesn't know anything about financial services, but the point is the federal government does know about financial services and does have fairly large, even now, institutions which deal with financial services. What kind of services should we be interested in delivering? Well, we're interested in making sure that they're profitable, that they're tested regionally, that they're delivered through the operations, the bricks and mortar locations, but also through the internet and telephone, including mobile phones, which is a big thing. In Italy, the postal financial services deliver a lot of their services through telephones, mobile phones. They have to be transparent without hidden fees and exactly operating in opposite manner to the fringe financial institutions and the payday loan lenders. They've got to be fair, delivered at the lowest cost. I mean, it's clear when the profit margin of the banks is in good times was around 30% before 2008, 2009 crisis. There is a large measure of being able to deliver financial services and still make an important profit. You don't have to say, okay, our option is to run services at a deficit. No, we can make a good profit, but without making it at 30%. It is possible to have a profit margin which is lower than that and deliver acceptable services to people at a good rate. Contributing to financial literacy. There again, our banks, the only people that really contribute a lot to financial literacy in terms of education is the Desjardins network in Quebec and the Van City, which is one of the big credit unions in Vancouver. Most of the big banks do nothing around financial literacy in terms of education And this is something which postal banking services could do in terms of educating people in the schools, educating people in the communities around the use of financial services. So we have to build on what okay. We have to have a particular emphasis on in postal banking on neighborhoods, both rural and urban, without a bank or a credit union, on Aboriginal communities, on the underbanked and the unbanked, and on special groups without adequate banking services, such as small businesses in rural areas and seniors, etc. It's interesting that the U.S. has used this term of the underbanked. And the underbanked is not the people who do not have a banking account. They have an account, but they don't use it. They use some of the fringe financial institutions, or they don't know how to use all the financial institutions. They're regularly in terms of the bank, of banks. And underbanked is a huge number of people out there, much bigger than the people who are unbanked. And certainly, this is one group which postal banking could appeal to and offer services to. We would have to, of course, build on services which Canada Post delivers, and that means the existing financial services. And of course, this is also what they say, we know nothing about financial services, and yet they're delivering all these financial services already. And they have an e-post network, which is only online for paying bills, but could also be it could also be in the post office branches. Why couldn't you go in there and pay your bills? If you can pay them online, why can't you go in and pay them in the post office as well? There again, that is a lot of unexplained emphasis which the present management of Canada Post puts on. But certainly there's the existing services, but there's also new services which could be offered in the sense that offering accounts, checking accounts and savings accounts at very low fees could be one possibility which could really help establish the postal banking system. But also, it could work with governments and existing governments in offering savings products such as bonds, both federal and provincial bonds, which are on sale and need to be developed because they have been sort of let to be run down as a system, but which could be sold through postal outlets as well. So there's a whole series of things, and then it could move into other areas such as mortgages, loans, insurance products, and even mutual funds and stocks. Now, the question is that not all of those have to be delivered or by 100% in terms of all of the expertise by a new postal banking system. Some of them could be delivered in terms of partnership with existing financial institutions. As long as the postal banking system has control over the operations and decides that it wants to have, for example, as is the case in Switzerland, where mortgages are delivered by a private bank in partnership with the Swiss postal banking system. So there are things like that could be done initially for a period of time, and all I would say should be done in terms of very open and transparent initiatives, and which are time related in the sense that they're time limited, to a certain period of time, a contract period, to see how it works out and see whether the postal bank wants to continue with that, to move on to another contract, or to take on that service itself. So I think also, as I've mentioned, that one of the real success stories of postal banking could be in terms of offering alternative to payday loans, and really getting rid of payday loans and saying, okay, we can offer the same kinds of things at a decent interest rate. Because you can't get a payday loan unless you have an income of some sort. And so people are just being ripped off at a tremendous interest rate. But yet the payday loan institution knows they're going to pay, because they have whether it's a paycheck or whether it's an EI check or welfare check or whatever it is, they know that they're going to get paid, and yet we allow this to continue. Also, that we could offer things like they do in New Zealand, which they have targeted mortgages where they make it much easier for a number of people to take out a mortgage, particularly in big cities where mortgages where housing is very expensive, where you can have a number of different income earners on the same mortgage. They encourage that so that a number of people can pool their income in order to buy a property. And they have special mortgages in New Zealand, which the Postal Bank has pioneered for Aboriginal, for the Maori community, their Aboriginal community, where the mortgage is only on the home and not on the land. The land remains communally owned. The house, it's only the house where the individual takes a mortgage on. And so this is really something which assures that the ownership of the land remains in the community. Now, that's something which obviously, if it was going to move in that direction of special programs for Aboriginal communities, have to be done in consultation with First Nations and other Aboriginal communities to move in that direction. But it's just to show you that postal banking allows you that kind of ability to do important new measures like that. And in France, one of the impressive things about the French Banque Postale is that they've moved into offering special programs for NGOs, for social economy organizations, for cooperatives, which really our banks here are not particularly interested in. Not interested in lending money to any of those institutions, and so this is what postal banking could also do. Now, in conclusion, I want to say that there are several possibilities of how it could work. If we look internationally, some countries have a non-chartered bank, in other words, a bank which is just part of the post office. Others have a chartered bank which is established as an independent entity owned by the post office. There's a possibility of having a credit union, a national credit union, which could deliver those services. So there are different ways. And I think that we'd have to examine which would be the best way for us to go forward around. But I think that delivering the services, we can decide on what are the services that we want to deliver immediately through postal banking, and what are the services we want to partner perhaps with other financial institutions, and what kind of plan do we have over the long term for building a successful postal bank. Now, the first step is to establish a task force. I'm going to sort of conclude here. I think that Canada Post, if there's a progressive administration, and of course I think that's going to happen not only hopefully through election change, but also in terms of building up a movement across Canada of people interested in preserving and strengthening the post office. Setting up a task force which would obviously have different representatives of stakeholders in there, including not only Canada Post, but communities, municipalities, business organizations, postal unions, people with disabilities, seniors organizations, all of those kinds of Aboriginal organizations, all those kinds of organizations could be on a task force which could see what are the financial services we want to deliver first. To me, this is as Canada Post itself says, as Linda was saying, a win-win situation. It's something which is not rocket science. This is a very easy, in terms of a public policy, this is nothing compared to other complicated public policies which we've brought in over the years in Canada, particularly say around healthcare or something like this. This is a very simple policy which has been tested and proved to operate in other countries. We could do it here, and we're only being blocked by the government and the management of Canada Post right now. But I think we can build a movement across the country of people who are interested in saving and expanding Canada Post, and this is one of the elements which can help us do that. So thank you very much, and willing to take any questions.
Donc, je vais parler en français.
So I will be speaking in French. Thank you very much, John. for that presentation. What we wanted to see was what would be possible. Is it feasible, for example, to have a postal bank in Canada? And the study carried out by John makes it clear that it is possible. It is possible to have a postal bank, and what is missing is the political will to make that happen on the part of the government and the political will of Canada Post as well to kind of be more creative and go off on a different track, the track laid out by the conference board, and to realize that it's possible, it's feasible, and there are various scenarios that could be explored. The only thing that is needed now is to say politically we're going to go for it and to establish a group or a task force that could take charge of that and eventually execute it. So I think now we have what we need to get this debate going with our brothers and sisters as well, because we have to discuss this with our members. But there are a lot of groups that are directly affected by the policies put in place by the Harper government. In terms of access to banking services and how they access them. And there are groups out there that are trying to exploit people who cannot get a bank account. So thank you, John. And now we're going to open it up for questions and comments. And we'll begin in the room here. If you have any questions or comments or clarifications to request, we have our two presenters here to take those questions. We'll do that for a certain amount of time and then move on to our last speaker for this morning. Questions, comments?
Ou idées à partager?
Any ideas you'd like to share with others in the room? So the first table over here, the sister here.
I'm a representative of the National Farmers Union, and I just wanted to say how excited I am to be here because I think I appreciate really the comments, especially by the first speakers, that we're illuminating the need for postal banking services in rural economies, and this really is in line with a lot of policies of the National Farmers Union as well. So I'm just quite happy to be here and really excited to hear more about how we can build this movement. So, thank you.
Sylvain?
Sylvain Lapointe, Canadian Union of Postal Workers. Maybe the question I'm going to ask is addressed more to our international guests, but I'd like to know what the experience has been in terms of training employees in postal services where they've introduced banking services, because this is a point that's been raised by Canada Post. Canada Post seems to think that in Quebec and Canada we're not smart enough to be able to provide banking services to the public. So I imagine there must be experiences in other countries that would be helpful.
Donald?
Donald? Thank you, Denis. I'd like to thank our two presenters.
You're raising the question of the Liquor Control Board of Ontario because it's an example I use all the time. And when I go to Alberta, you know, the reality, everybody knows the reality of Alberta as it relates to the sale of liquor. So I often talk to the young workers in these locations, and I say to them, you know, if you were in Ontario, you'd be making like $25 an hour. You'd have a uniform. You'd have holidays, a pension. And they go, really? What happened here? I said, it's called privatization. And that's the reality. So when I was at the New Brunswick Federation of Labor in the fall, I got up to the mic and spoke about that. So I think it's an excellent example. And I believe in the French media in Quebec, they were saying in 2012 that SAQ brought in like $85 million in profits or something. So Ontario would be even more than that. I think that's it. 1.7, there you go. So my question, also, John, on the study, we took it to Labor Notes a few weeks ago. It was very well received, and it's being used by the 4 American postal unions who are, as you pointed out, pushing for banking in the postal banking in the United States. Now, you know, the ruling class is always talking about lowering taxes, and I just want to go to the number you gave us, Linda, of $30 billion. Has anyone ever done, like, that's how much money the banks bring in, a 17% return on investment. So what would that mean to the tax base in Canada? Has anybody ever looked at that? But, and that's only one sector. You know, what would happen if we nationalized the energy sector or natural resources, the income from that? What would that mean in the context of how much taxes Canadians pay? Thank you.
So we'll take the brother at the back, and after that, we'll
Dennis
let you
Howlett
answer.
with Canadians for Tax Fairness. Kind of a segue on the tax question. I agree that we need to find ways to make our mixed economy have a better mix. And this is one of the ways we could do it. And I accept what Linda was saying, how there are problems with the banks and the services they provide. But a question, and maybe John could answer this, why don't the credit unions provide an alternative more than they are now? I think I know some of the answers, but I think that question should be asked and answered. And why do we need, you know, couldn't the credit unions fill that needs gap that Linda was talking about? And why do we need a postal banking system instead?
Okay. You have some answer? Comment?
So answers.
Yeah, maybe, and after that, we have another tour.
I'll just quickly talk about the LCBO thing. Yeah, I mean, it is the classic example, and as you point out, it's by privatizing, liquor services in Alberta, it's so detrimental to the employee. Also detrimental, I would argue, to the public, losing the money. In the United States, where, of course, everything's privatized, you go into half the liquor stores and you go in, of course, guns are allowed everywhere there. I mean, it's a dangerous experience. I mean, we have in Canada, in Ontario, we have these liquor stores. There's a liquor store now, they've renovated the beautiful old train station. It's just gorgeous. I mean, liquor consumption's become like going to a spa or something in Ontario. And it makes these huge profits. But of course, that is exactly what is so terrifying to the right, is the idea that these services, even something like selling liquor, which isn't even essential, well, in some ways it is essential, can be done so efficiently and to the public benefit when we do these things publicly. That, I think, is ultimately what terrifies them. Just quickly on the tax point, I mean, what we've seen in this country since 2000, we've cut our corporate tax rate in half. So that if you just look in general, I was doing something for a column the other day, noting that given the tax cut, like just that cut in the tax rate, like leaving aside things like the use of tax havens and stuff like that, that tax cut has saved corporations, is now currently saving corporations $20 billion a year. Like, in other words, if we'd kept our tax rate where it was in 2000, just kept it where it was, and there's no argument that we've made our economy any more competitive by cutting it, we'd have an extra $20 billion a year to play with. You could have a national daycare program, a national pharmaceutical program, a whole bunch of things. So the tax cutting thing is, so important. And that $30 billion, one of the things that's so terrible about the way the corporate tax cuts have been done in Canada is that they're across the board. So they've applied equally to, corporations with very minimal profit levels as they do to the banks with those massive 20 to 30% profit range, 30 billion in profits a year, as well as to the big resource companies. And I am just so pleased to see Dennis here today from Canadians for Tax Fairness, because I'm trying to think of the number. I've seen it before, and I'm just guessing Dennis will have it at the top of his head, about how much those corporate tax cuts, how much of those $20 billion a year in savings go to the banks, because I think I've seen a sort of cumulative number that such and such number of billions, and if you don't have the number, make it up. No. Let's put it this way: it's an enormous, profitable. The fact that they are not targeting those tax cuts, like they're not linking them to job creation. In fact, the banks close down outlets, and we reward them with ever lower taxes. So, I mean, I think the tax point is a very important one.
D'abord sur la question de la formation.
Now, with respect to training, it's clear that it takes a postal banking system to train employees in banking techniques and so forth. But it's important to realize that employees at the post office are already there with their computers. They handle all kinds of different transactions and provide financial services, credit cards, and so forth. The fact is that Canada Post has an entire delivery system in place that is secure. It provides for these services to be provided. And according to the UK postal system, that is important, but it's not a huge challenge to train employees. And as I mentioned previously, they do that in the UK with 300 people. And now with all these other services available on the internet or Skype or the phone system, it is possible to provide specialist services through the post offices that are nowhere near the center. So someone in Ottawa, for example, could provide those services quite easily to someone who needed a loan or who needed a mortgage and so forth elsewhere. All of that can be done much more easily now than in the past.
On to the other question here about credit unions. Well, the problem with credit unions is that credit unions did, for a time, take up some of the branches that were closed down. But they've even stopped doing that now, the banking branches that were closed down. Because really the problem with credit unions is, by and large, credit unions are local and regional. They are still regulated by provinces, although now you can have a federally regulated credit union. There aren't any right now. And so they have much more limited possibilities of expansion. They're very timid, rightly so, in terms of saying, okay, we're going to open up a branch in some community where we have no connection with that, when their membership comes out of often a community, or often it comes out of unions or whatever, who are the base of their membership. Like Alternative's base of membership in Ottawa is civil service members. So they're unlikely to go to a community where they have no knowledge of that community, they have no membership. And on the other hand, what I found in the work that I did was that both Desjardins and the English Canadian, or the Credit Union Central of Canada, which is the credit unions outside of Francophone Canada by and large, both of them were very interested in the possibility of partnering with Canada Post around financial services. And that's exactly because they don't want to necessarily go and build a bricks and mortar location when there's a wonderful post office in a rural community which is there. Why are they going to go in and build another? But they could offer some services through that, and Canada Post could make a sizable profit by partnering with credit unions around delivering some of these services. So I think that's something which could be examined. And they're open to that. They see that as something which they could do. So I think but I still think that having a national postal bank network is the way to go, because there's nothing like the solidity of a national network, which is in every region of the country, right, and which can, in many regions where no bank is going to go. You know, there are no banks, hardly at all, and no credit unions hardly at all for example, in northern Canada. There just aren't any. They haven't, and the reason is they're scared to go there, et cetera, et cetera. But there are post offices. There are post offices all over the place, and they could deliver some of the financial services. And I think that that's only through postal banking. We couldn't. The credit unions would not be willing to take on that because of the way that they're organized on a local and regional basis. They don't have a kind of a national vision of how they could move forward.
Just before, I think we can include our brothers and sisters who are on live stream. So I have two questions. I lost one, but I remember him. So the first one was coming from brother Shane O'Brien, and it's mostly around banking. So would it operate under its own banking charter, or could regional partnership be made with existing banks? So he has the question somewhere: what are the possibilities out there? Maybe what can be the first one, and maybe that's mostly for John. But there's other that I lost, but I remember the person was asking the question. So would you feel it's possible to achieve postal banking under the Harper government? We have to wait until October 2015 to address the issue when we will have the federal election. So that's the two questions coming from our brothers and sisters. So thank you.
I'll just answer that very quickly. The last one first is that, you know, probably as a bit of a pessimist, I'd have to say, around the Harper government, I'd have to say it's unlikely to get this through the Harper government. However, I was very buoyed by what happened last week, where the Harper government, around the Senate, around temporary foreign workers, and around the Elections Act, had to beat a retreat on all three of those issues. And what that showed to me was that if you build a strong enough movement around this issue, you might even be able to make some progress. And I mean, a first step would be to get a task force. Can't we get even if they're not going to make a decision, the Harper government, before the elections, can we not get a task force to look at this issue and to take up the different possibilities how it could work? So I think all that is possible, although unlikely with the Harper government, but I think it could be done. On the issue of regional partnerships, yes, I mean, that's what I think could be done. There could be regional partnerships in terms of Canada Post partnering around certain services which the Postal Bank would not want to deliver right away. It could partner with credit unions regionally. It could partner with Desjardins in Quebec to deliver. It could partner with, Saskatchewan with a credit union network there to deliver certain of those services in a partnership fashion. So the Canada Post would also make a profit for doing that. And as I said, in other countries, some of the other countries, it is done this way. They have some services, for example, in Switzerland, which are delivered. Most of the services are delivered by the Crown, by the state-owned postal bank, but some others are delivered through that, but in partnership with an existing financial institution. So that could be done, and there's absolutely no reason, particularly when you're looking at, say, mortgages or something like that, where that couldn't be done on a regional basis.
Okay, oh yeah, go.
Just very quickly on that political question about the. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I mean, it strikes me the Harper government would be extremely resistant to this, but that is, of course, no reason not to organize around it. I think, and as John points out, they can be pushed back sometimes. But even more importantly, if they're unwilling to be pushed back, it's a terrific issue to fight them over. In fact, John and I were talking about this yesterday, and in fact, you made the great point, John, that the Harper Conservatives continue to be dominant in the rural parts of the country, even though they do nothing but abandon the interests and essentially kind of shut down the rural areas. It's just sort of one nail in the coffin after another. And so, you know, this could be a terrific issue to organize around, to point out how poorly, you know, the banks and by extension the Harper government that's allowing the situation is serving our rural communities, is serving ordinary Canadians, you know, without big resources, and that this is a service that Canadians could desperately benefit from. I mean, it's just a wonderful issue, and we know, I can't resist adding, we know that the NDP is supporting postal banking. This would be a terrific issue to organize around for the next election.
Donc, I saw many hands, so Jim?
I work in Ottawa now, but my home is Edmonton, and I live in a working class neighborhood there, and northeast Edmonton, and you can walk down the street and you can recognize the facade of a number of places that used to be banks, and they're not banks anymore. They're some of them are turned into small stores or other kinds of things, but they're gone. Well, that's they haven't taken a bank and turned it into a liquor store in my neighborhood, but I'm surprised given the level of consumption. But the one financial institution that I do have in my neighborhood is the Alberta Treasury Branch. And here I am from Alberta, not noted for being a left-wing province, but it has the only government-owned financial institution that takes deposits for the public and this kind of thing. It's the Alberta Treasury Branch. And the history of that organization, I think, is fairly illustrative. It was formed in the 30s when the Depression was happening and the rural areas of my province were decimated, and all the banks fled. You couldn't get money to farm or to buy seed or to anything. And so the provincial government, social credit, a little bit wacky, but they basically set up financial institutions. They set up a provincial bank, and they basically did it. And it's quite successful. It goes into areas where nobody else will go, and it has. Now, it's not as adventurous now than it was back then, but what I find particularly illustrative here is that the Conservative government of Alberta has tried to kill it a couple of times. And the rural base of that party, the Tory party in Alberta, has risen up en masse and pushed it back because they realize that this is the only banking services that they'll get. So this may be one of the reasons that Harper and those want, is because, or are refusing, is because they know once we have it, we won't lose it. Because the people basically need the banks in the communities, and they support it. And so you've got farmers who would vote Tory for everything else, but if they took away the Alberta Treasury Branch from their community, they would not vote Tory again.
No, that is very interesting. And in fact, well, the Alberta one is particularly successful because it still exists, but Ontario did a similar thing. In the 30s, it set up the Ontario Savings Bank. And for years, it was, or in the early days, it was very important. Again, pressure from Conservatives and from the banking industry eventually led to it being shut down. I think they finally closed it down completely in the late 80s or early 90s. But it always struck me as, an amazing thing. Why would you close down this public branch, this public banking system? And I think the answer was because, it didn't have the base as strong as the Alberta one, and it was kind of an affront to the banks to have it there, kind of showing them up. But yeah, that your example of the Alberta branch bank is very interesting.
Le confrère de France, je pense, a demandé la parole.
Our brother from France wants the floor. Yes. Hi, I'm Nicolas Galipides. Just to add to this idea of training, the tellers in the French post office, well, we receive about 3 and 6 weeks of training. Initial training as a teller, and then there are various operations that you can carry out with the teller. And 3 to 6 weeks after the training, you have the whole banking chain, as Isabel was saying. you have financial advisors and a sales force. We still have to work on that. As far as I'm concerned, we'll be revisiting this issue. And the teller's wicket, well, there are 3 operations and 2 operations, and it's not so complicated with the information system that we have now. Any other questions or comments?
I just wanted to just make a few points to support why we think banking would work in our post offices. First of all our employees and our members are security cleared. They're good at authenticating people. I understand Corporation Act. The language has never been taken out to allow the reemergence of postal banking. And actually, there was a pilot project done on this, and it was in Newfoundland, and Louise Aide, who is the president of the Newfoundland branch, could expand on that.
There was a pilot project back in the late 80s that took place in Newfoundland, a partnership between Canada Post and the Bank of Nova Scotia. And as a result, there were a number of post offices picked to have banking services in the post offices. And I just want to speak when I heard about the training. This was back in the 90s when our post offices didn't have any computers. So the postmasters had to be trained on computers as well as the banking. And as far as we're concerned, that was a successful pilot project. However, the corporation and the Bank of Nova Scotia, they pulled it after a couple of years. But in regards to training, we've done it. We've been there. We can certainly do it again. So it's when I look at what you're talking about and I look at where we've been with this is totally doable.
OK, merci. Donc, on va...
Thank you. Let's move on to the next step, and we'll have another speaker, and I will take the questions just after the speaker. We'll talk about banks again. So I'll take your name. Well, go ahead, please. Yes, you go ahead.
My name's George Collins, and I'm from New Zealand. And the Kiwi Bank example, it started in 2002. And if you walk into a New Zealand Post branch now, you can just, any transaction, any banking transaction is just done normally. I mean, the staff diversified very quickly. And talking to one of the general managers in the human resources area, yes, it was very stressful getting it up and running, but 10, 12 years on now, Kiwi Bank is just a part of the retail network. And so there's, my view would be, it is not a problem around training. And I just have a look at what the stores network I've got in front of me, and they trained over 2,000 people. We're a bit smaller than, 60,000 sheep, 4,500 people. So we're just a bit smaller than Canada. But they train 2,000 people a year, and that's those diversified products. So it's not a problem. Thank you.
Okay. Donc on a...
Now we have 1 or 2 questions that from the live stream, and they're about privatization. So it's an opportunity for me, in a way, to introduce our third speaker, because in the first place, we had looked at the issue of banks, and now we have an idea about what it is about, and that's why we asked John Anderson to look into that. But we know that our goal is to maintain the universal postal public service, something that belongs to Canadians. We are also fighting against deregulation and the threat of privatization. In that context, we asked IRIS, which is a young group and a research group in Quebec, we asked them to look into the privatization issue and to determine how the postal banking services could integrate into Quebec with the example of the Caisse Populaire des Jardins, and we had the example of the credit unions in the other provinces, but in Quebec you have the Caisse Populaire. So Simon Tremblay-Pépin works with IRIS and works on economic issues, and he works regularly with unions, so we asked him to do some research on that issue. Simon, you have the floor. Hi, and thank you. Thank you very much for having me here today. It is very interesting, and thank you to the two previous speakers. Your presentations were very enlightening, and I really enjoyed reading Mr. Anderson's work and our colleagues at the CCPA. It's always a pleasure to collaborate with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, and thank you to the CUPW for welcoming here in this symposium, and thank you to all the workers who are working so hard for the interpretation and for the transmission of our speeches in various languages. It's always an honor to have receive so much attention at a conference. So I was asked to do research work on the privatization of Canada Post. I found it would be an interesting idea to look into the privatization of Canada Post because, as you know, we're not alone in talking about privatization. The C.D. Howe Institute published an economic paper saying it would be a good idea, and the Montreal Economic Institute, which you probably know, said the same thing. The Fraser Institute said the same thing as well. So we said, well, we're not surprised that those outfits would say they should privatize because they're in favor of privatizing virtually everything. So why should Canada Post be different? But given that IRIS, since it was formed in 2000, has been studying privatization, in particular the privatization of the LCBO, for instance, on the Alberta model. I read recently, by the way, a research paper by the Parkland Institute on the privatization of services, for instance, alcohol distribution, as we have in Quebec and in Ontario, privatized in Alberta. And we learned that since 1993, $1.5 billion were lost by the Alberta government. So it's not a good idea. But what about the postal system? You know the arguments. That we know those arguments. They say the postal service is doing less well. The mail volume is dropping. There are pension difficulties. You heard the federal government moved recently on the issue of the pension fund. And they say, consequently, this is a service people are using less and less. While keeping it in public hands, we should privatize it. A lot of people have done it across the world, so why shouldn't we follow suit here in Canada? Well, at first sight, it might seem an interesting idea. We felt, why not look into it? And the CUPW was kind enough to help us get started with this study. And it's a fact that in Europe, many countries have deregulated and privatized their postal sector. So we said we should look at what happened there. Of course, I'm a bit intimidated by the presence of people in Europe who experienced this firsthand, that is this privatization and liberalization, whereas I only observed it by reading the work published by other researchers. But I'm available for comments, and I'm ready to be corrected if I were to be mistaken in my analysis of the privatization that took place in those countries. The first thing I must say is that you understand that this argument in favor of privatization, which will be strengthened as Canada Post reduces its service offer, will always have better arguments in favor of privatization because the stamps will cost more and there will be fewer post offices and door-to-door delivery will be reduced. And then people will say, why do we maintain this in the public hands if this is what we get? You know how the media work. I have a publication on the way the media work, and it's not a bestseller, unlike Linda's, but it's been relatively successful. In that work, we notice that often the media always like looking into the future rather than looking at what is happening right now. So they've already, in part, buried Canada Post by saying, oh, it's going very badly, they're not making money. And they forget that for 16 years, except in 2011, Canada Post made a profit and gave back money to Canadians. And they ignored that because they're already living in the future. Even though the future they're looking into, it is the negative future that organizations such as the Conference Board and the Canada Post Corporation is projecting. So the privatization of the postal service has always been presented as being in favor of competition. Oh, well, it's going to bring competition to the postal sector and it's going to re-energize it. But firstly, let's try to look at the downside of competition in the postal service from the European experience. Firstly, most of the time when there was privatization in Europe, the former postal operator, the corporation that had the monopoly, remained the benchmark for people, meaning that for most people, here we see the modernization of communications in action. For most people, there is only one operator in that sector in their life. Let's take the case of Germany, England, or Sweden, where they liberalized or privatized their postal sector for over a decade in some cases. Well, what we've noticed there is that over 90% of people there continue to do business with the former postal operator. Did that change anything in their life because competition came in? Did they jump on any new opportunity offering lower rates? No. Nothing changed. It's still the old public service provider that they run to. Let's look at prices. Did prices drop remarkably in Europe? As far as stamps go, no. All the studies show that the price of stamps have remained stable, and the price of stamps has been going up across the world, everywhere anyway. But privatization didn't lead to any major drop in the price of stamps. In 2013, in fact, in the US and in Canada, where the services are mostly public, the price of stamps were actually lower, much lower than in all the countries where the postal service had been privatized or liberalized. And now, Canada Post has just jacked up considerably the price of stamps, and now we're at the European average with this increase. So you see the situation. What we studied was to look at the viewpoint of the consumers. Are there major advantages at first sight for most people? No, at first sight, there are no marked advantages to the privatization and liberalization of the postal service. What usually happens with that is that you create a second postal service, specializing in what? Corporate services. Why? Because corporations have huge mailings at low prices, and that is a very profitable sector for a corporation. For instance, 10 clients sending hundreds of letters, well, we give them a very good price, and we don't take care of the other clients because they will not go and create rural post offices. They're not interested in that. They're interested in making money with big corporations. And that sector develops, and then corporations say, well, they offer better prices, so I'll go with them. But for most consumers, there is no marked advantage. In fact, it might be thought that it would be interesting to privatize Canada Post because the corporation is not doing well. So why tie it to the federal government? Why take the risk of asking for this corporation to stay public and pay for their bills? But it's as if suddenly the federal government, which already has legislation that doesn't allow it to pay for Canada Post losses, it's as if suddenly there were no connection, no legal connection between the two entities. The federal government could let Canada Post go bankrupt or shut down. That is a crazy idea. Could the federal government morally tell Canadians you will no longer have any postal service? Of course not. And we know that experience. The key example is Air Canada. You saw what happened with the privatization of Air Canada. In theory, we're paying more for Air Canada, but when they have problems, the first door they knock on is the federal door. And when they have labor problems, we know that the federal government intervenes and adopts special legislation. So it's a private corporation, but managed by the public, regardless. Another aspect that is often trotted out as an advantage is that when there is privatization, private corporations will invest in Canada Post. But that's funny logic because we're being told that investors want to invest in it, but we're being told that this is a dying sector. Why would investors rush in? Let's just look at how private investors would react. You know that over the last few years, Canada Post had an agreement with the federal government to use dividends that usually are paid into the federal coffers to invest in their structures. What investor would accept that? I won't give you money for some time, but I have to build my coffers up. No private investor would do that. If Canada Post were privatized, the infrastructure would be older than with a public corporation where they have to renew their infrastructure and reinvest their dividends in that infrastructure upgrade. However, in terms of the downside, the European examples are very interesting as well. In the case of the service quality, we talked about the postal banking service example and access to post offices. Let's take the cases of Germany and Austria, where you'll find a drop in the number of post offices, representing about 40% of the post offices being lost after privatization. People are already saying in Canada that the post office is far from where we live. It's tough when I have a parcel to pick up. Imagine when 40% of those post offices will be lost, the effect that would have on consumers. So it's quite dubious to say it would be interesting. Not to talk about the issue of post office boxes and advertising. You have to understand that if you have a second service provider targeting corporations, corporations will say, well, I'll do business with them because that way I will send out more mailings. Who does that? Mostly those who do advertising, which means there will be more advertising in people's mailboxes, fewer post offices, and all that without reducing cost. So you can see that it's weighing on consumers. And in addition to that, there is the problem of the national network that Canada Post represents. Canada Post is present in a lot of small communities. We all know full well that when you send a letter from one of those small remote communities, I come from the Matapédia, a small village in the Matapédia, to send mail to Montreal, or even to mail a letter from Montreal to Montreal, the costs are different. But the price of the stamp remains the same across the country. But in many countries where there is privatization or liberalization, governments have to regulate or even set up systems to ensure that the price of stamps will remain the same across the country. And sometimes they're forced to subsidize the price of stamps to make sure that they stay the same across the country. So that's strange. People say we should privatize a service only to refinance it through the back door to ensure that the postal stamp remains the same. So how would that be an advantage, not only for the consumers, but also for the Canadian government to privatize Canada Post, in spite of all the calls for that? And one of the last arguments that I put in my research note, and that you know better than me, is the issue of jobs. Canada Post offers jobs across Canada, well-paid jobs for now, and relatively stable jobs. And the salaries paid by Canada Post represent $4.2 billion. And what I keep saying is that we have to be cautious. After the economic recession, we're beginning to play with such key elements of the Canadian economy by saying, well, we should start restructuring the economy, whereas the Canada Post gives us jobs everywhere, including in small communities where it's essential to have such stable jobs that are well paid for the purposes of funding the local economy and stimulating the local economy. But people are saying, oh, so those salaries might be reduced. So let's take the city of Berlin in Germany, where the city felt obliged to subsidize the postal workers because the salaries were too low. Imagine the salary level we're talking about. When you read those reports, you realize that they're dealing with over 2,000 subcontractors for mail delivery, and often with taxi companies. So when they say, well, the postal service is important, it has to be secure, well, when you're dealing with 2,000 subcontractors, maybe you cannot really vouch for the safety of the transactions and the mailings. I'm talking about universality, as I was saying a while ago. I'm talking of European countries. If you've looked at the map of the world, you will notice that the difference in size between Canada and Europe and our population density, they're huge. If you have to subsidize in small European countries to ensure the universality of the price of stamps, imagine what would happen in a huge country like Canada. Whereas right now, we have a postal service that costs less than in other countries that there was liberalization, and yet we've maintained a universal service. So how could a privatized service offer this? One of the solutions, and one was brilliantly presented to you a few minutes ago, and I did focus on that, because the first time I was told about the possibility of creating a postal banking service, I asked myself, well, in school in Quebec, we used to receive little brown envelopes, not for corruption purposes. That happens later in Quebec's history. We were given small envelopes in which we should put 1 cent, pieces of 1 cent, 5 cents, and 10 cents that we would send to the Caisse des Jardins. And in all Quebec schools, we were basically made members of the Caisse des Jardins, and we were taken to church. Those are the two foundations of our cultural community, I guess. So we were made to fill those brown envelopes with 1 cent and 5 cents and 10 cents pieces, and today there are millions of Quebecers who are members of the Caisse des Jardins network. It's a major network, and we have to take that into account when we say that we're going to set up a new banking service system. Desjardins is far from being perfect as far as I'm concerned, and I'm still waiting for the opportunity to write a research paper on the problems of the Desjardins network, but I will not do that today. I must point out, though, that since 2006, we've noticed a reduction in the number of Caisses Populaires Desjardins by 15%. Yes, they cover the whole territory. That's a fact. If you travel across Quebec, you'll see that next to a church, there is a post office, and then there is a Caisse Populaire Desjardins. It's well represented, it's well spread out. But given the reduction in the number of people using the caisse, that's why some of them are closing down. And given that there is also the reduction of in the use of postal services, wouldn't it be interesting to create a partnership between two organizations that would be interested in pooling their resources in order to stay alive? I think it would be very interesting to develop that point of view. And I hear here that there is interest in that, and we should be looking into the strategy that would work. The only strategy for Canada Post, I'm talking of just one strategy here, the parcel solution, for instance. This is no news to you. It is obviously the growth sector in the postal sector.
Can the Post, instead of reducing services, could they say, instead of reducing services, could we say our competition in the private sector who are making lots of money with parcels are people that we want to beat at their own game? Could we be so brave instead of saying, oh, well, let's do less and less and give more and more room to the private sector? We know the logic behind this. It's a logic that will slowly bring us to the privatization of the post office. That's what Lucien Bouchard had said behind closed doors when he said, let's make the animal hungry. If you reduce the efficiency of the post office, more and more people will be calling for privatization. So we believe that we should have another vision, a vision that we've had in the past, and that is to develop public services to open ourselves up to new opportunities, and I think that a postal banking service would allow us to go forward in that field. Thank you very much. So thank you very much, Simon, for that point of view, and to reinforce our arguments against privatization. It seems obvious that with the present situation of Canada Post, if these deficits continue, people will speak more and more of privatization. There are interest groups who are just waiting for the opportunity to call for the privatization of the postal services. So thank you for supporting us and giving us some more arguments for allowing us to say, let's look elsewhere in the world where the postal service has been privatized and where it has gone wrong. So we have a question before us. Let me, from the internet. So the question that was presented by Mark Armstrong in English, he says,
Public Banking Institute and its new sister organization, Bank Act, which is prioritizing, organizing around, and advocating for postal banking in the USA. My question has to do with privatization. Would not a public-private partnership in postal banking open the door to privatization? In other words, would it be better to make this a 100% public option in order to prevent future privatization? So it's mostly around USA, but je pense que la même question pourrait se poser ici.
But I think we can ask the same question here in Canada. So that's our first question. Are there other questions concerning privatization, banks, and so on? If not, let's start with that one. Simon, John?
I mean, I think that, of course, the key question there is the Postal Services still a public service? That's the first question. And if it's a public service and not simply a private service being delivered by a public entity, I think that's a very, very important question we have to answer. I consider postal services as a public services, just like a whole series of other, like education and health. This is a public service. So I think that's the first question that has to be we have to be very, very clear on. Secondly, can we have any form of partnership with private institutions when we have a public service? And I would say the answer is yes, we can, as long as they're controlled and as long as the public service is sure that those private services are not becoming the majority of services or whatever. For example, right now, the post office offers credit cards which are actually delivered by Van City, which is a credit union, and that I don't consider that necessarily a bad partnership in that sense. And we can move towards. We can look at that. We can say, okay, is the post office getting the best return on that partnership in terms of those cards? I don't know what the details are in terms of how much money is made by Canada Post, but if it isn't, then the Postal Service, Canada Post, can look at taking that back into public hands completely, or looking for another partner. I think the whole question is, do we have control, and are the major part of the services delivered by publicly owned, publicly paid employees? I think that's to me is the main question. Can some services be made in a partnership? I think yes, they can, and as long as that is controlled, as long as it's for a limited time, where it's renewed and looked at, and is that the way we want to go forward on this or that services? I would say in postal banking, you would have a situation where most of the services would be delivered through Canada Post itself in some kind of either non-chartered or chartered bank operation. But some services could also, I would submit, be delivered in partnership with a private or co-op institution.
Simon?
Well, very briefly. Does partnership mean privatization? Let's not be discouraged. If we offer more services because of banking services, if Canada Post increases its services through banking, it reduces the risk of privatization. It's only if you reduce services that you increase the risk of privatization, because then you allow private services to encroach on your service. But if Canada Post increases its services, I don't think you'll do it through partnership. And if we ask the question, should it continue to be a public service, I think to answer the question, we should ask ourselves, is there the possibility for us to get rid of that service? If the answer is no, if we don't want, if we need a postal service for reasons of basic communication Canada, well then it's justified to keep it as a public service. That's the way I see it.
To this, it strikes me that whenever we have public services and then we sort of have introduced the private element into them somewhat, as we have in healthcare, for instance, in Canada, it's generally done not to make the thing more effective or the service better. In fact, I think as Simon points out, that what happens is typically the private sector skims off the profitable portions. That doesn't leave us any better ahead. What it's typically done for, I think, is to kind of appease the right, to kind of hold off the criticism from the Conservatives that we're all so always afraid of. Rather than standing up and defending the importance of public services, we sort of tend to kowtow and sort of, can we accommodate these private services somehow? And I would say that kind of appeasement strategy gets us nowhere, that in fact it tends to weaken the public system because, they do skim off the more profitable parts and without improving the system. And it doesn't win over the right or the Conservatives anyway, because they want, they're going to push for more. I would say let's support strong public systems. If there's something that the post office can't do for whatever reason and needs to partner with a private bank, fine. But if it's a service that we can provide effectively through the post office, I see no reason to dilute it in order to win some political capital with people that won't be persuaded anyway.
Sylvain Lapointe, if we look at the Harper government agenda, and when we look at the situation in Quebec and the two supposed experts who proposed to sell parts of Crown corporations in Quebec, Hydro-Quebec, and the SAQ, they propose privatization. So when you look at the extreme right philosophy of Harper, who supports a private enterprise, this is more of a comment than a question. But I think it's important for us to debate the whole question of privatization. And it's important to have this presentation. Why? Because is it not easier to privatize a system where you have community mailboxes and where the service is not very good? As it was said previously, right now, the public loves us, loves the post office. Why? Because we have letter carriers who go from door to door and meet them every day. It would be different if community mailboxes offer this service everywhere. But are they not implementing CBMs to encourage privatization by reducing the efficiency of services? And then they'll be able to sell it to the private sector that will make profits from it. Now, I think we have to point out the consequences of this activity of the federal government and Canada Post to the public. Nicolas. Thank you. Well, very briefly, on the question of privatization of the post offices in Europe, there have been no surprises. Canada Post, or the French post office, continues to have the monopoly. No other operator can deliver the mail in France. That's obvious. Now, on the question of jobs, one of the main reasons invoked by the European Commission to limit competition in France is the fact that there's a right to work and there's a minimum salary. This a minimum salary is considered an obstacle to the market. Now, on partnerships, we'll be discussing this this afternoon. We've had partnership in France between the post office and the Caisse des Dépôts, which is like the Caisse des Jardins. We have the Livret A and so on. There have been this kind of partnership for loans, for example, consumer loans, for example. But like Simon was saying, when there's bankruptcy, we had the bankruptcy of the Banque de l'Exia. There were billions of dollars worth of losses. Who had to guarantee this bank? The government. It was the Postal Bank that is now loaning to communities and so on. So these are good examples. You might say it's obvious. Now, here's my question. What are the positions of your different forces here? You have the opposition of the government, but is it still possible to have public services in Canada? Well, here we're getting into the political aspects of the banks. We have a question from Fred in Toronto.
NDP support postal banking. Where do the Liberals and the Bloc Québécois are, where they are? So, toucher un peu l'aspect politique.
So, you brought up the political question. We have political critics here. Let's start with Simon on this question. Well, to answer your question about how to get to privatization, I think it's obvious. This is not the first Crown Corporation to go down that road. The more and more you have a service that looks commercial, the more and more it's interesting to privatize it in the future. So you have to look at who criticized the Harper government for the fact that they're offering less and less services. But if you transform the service to reduce the service, you will end up with privatization. It's also interesting to look at what happened in Europe. I believe that the whole question of knowing if in Canada and in Quebec we have the impression that, yes, the postal service is important to them. Well, when you look at what was tabled in Quebec yesterday with the Liberal government, and where we're told, in fact, you should sell part of your Crown corporations to repay your debt. That's a proposal on the table. Well, when you see that, you can see that the whole concept of privatization is in the news and in the mind of our governments and our leaders. That's why I believe it's important to prepare our arguments to fight against privatization. The risk of privatization has always existed. The concept has been discussed for many years, but it's becoming more obvious now, and we have to get ready to fight it.
I just wanted to comment on how familiar the privatization and the push for it that you speak of sounds very familiar to the privatization and corporatization of agriculture in our country. With the dismantling of the Canadian Wheat Board, and currently there is a push towards an act that will basically sign us onto an international treaty that will further privatize seeds in our country, and with cuts to public plant breeding and whatnot. I would be really interested, actually, if Iris would do a study on how this has affected other countries that have signed on to this treaty thus far, which was enacted in a convention in 1991, in fact. And that was more of a comment, but thank you for pointing that out, and it's very familiar to us indeed. But that also, I just had a question for everyone, and I'm not as familiar with the Bank Act and whatnot, but what are the challenges regulation-wise with doing postal banking? Because as Linda pointed out earlier, it's a very protected system that the banks have currently with the oligopoly. And so I'm just wondering what the challenges are to that regulation-wise.
I don't think that would actually be a problem because, well, for one thing, the postal banking legislation is still on the books, right? We as John was pointing out, we had postal banking for, what was it, 100 years, and we killed it.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, the postal banking is still in the books. That's the first thing. Second of all, as I mentioned, the federal government already has a very large banking system. Most people are not aware of that unless you're in the agriculture communities. You probably know, Farm Credit Canada. It's a huge banking institution which makes millions and millions of dollars of loans and millions of dollars of profit, and is used by the present government, I think, in a certain way to maintain a certain influence in certain areas that it wants to maintain some strength in. But I think that so the expertise is there, and it already has banking institutions. So in fact, for us to move towards postal banking would be fairly simple, a simple measure. So I don't think that's. I was just going to make one comment on privatization, is that I think it's important to note that privatization often sounds like a really good idea, as Simon was saying, how everything's going to work better when it's privatized. But the reality is most privatizations are a disaster. I'll just give you two examples from personal experience. One was the privatization of the public waterworks system in Hamilton. I don't know if anybody's from Hamilton here, but where they actually, the city council sold off the public water system to a private company. That private company turned out to be owned and eventually owned by Enron, and the whole thing was a disaster. But they finally retook that back into public ownership in Hamilton because it was such a disaster when it was publicly managed. Interestingly enough, some of the biggest backers of the privatization were some of the top civil servants in Hamilton, who then got jobs with the privatized company, who endorsed the privatization and got much higher salaries, etc. So I mean that's something I'm always very, very skeptical of how that works. The other, I guess, really interesting example, just very quickly, is in the UK, where the transportation system, I think we have somebody from the UK here, right? But I mean, the privatization of the rail system, the private has been a disaster, the privatization of the bus system, all these systems which were under public ownership were privatized, and it's been a terrible mess. I remember living in the UK when they had competitive, instead of having one bus system from London to Oxford, you had competitive bus systems, so that different bus companies would compete on the same route and try to race to the next stop to pick up passengers. So the first one that got there would get the passengers, right? And obviously a totally dangerous, inefficient system, where they were using old equipment, all this kind of things in order to make a minimal amount of profit. So, I mean, in general, we've got to be very, very careful about the language of, privatization will, as Simon's pointed out, will get you any better results, as you've mentioned in the post office. It's something which I think the right and the big newspapers have managed to convince a lot of people about, that private is always better, and that's complete nonsense. And the facts will show you how untrue that is, if we can get the facts out there.
Just pour en ajouter une.
Just to add another layer to this argument. Now, if privatization was really serious, imagine what you'd be talking about. Is there one potential private operator who could develop in Canada a new postal service next to the existing one? I mean, just saying it shows the folly of that proposal. Would you have two box offices or postal boxes side by side? That would be real privatization. And when you speak of inefficiency, you see that would be the case. And we know that private enterprise would not want that. Their objective would be to get the major clients, the major companies, and that's why they would like to privatize. They don't want to privatize it to go get Mr. Thompson's letter and deliver it across the country. They have no interest for that. That is not at all what would allow them to make money. What would allow them to make big profits would be to receive more advertising because they can offer lower prices. That's the reason why they would want privatization. And for us as consumers, that would not be interesting. And that is why is what would happen with privatization. Just think what happened with the phone sector. When we said, let's open up the sector of telecommunications and Bell will no longer be a monopoly. Is there a telephone company that created a new network next to Bell's network? Not at all. They shared Bell's network, and different people now offer services on the same network at different prices. So privatization is always a possibility for the private sector to make more money, but it's not advantageous for the consumer.
Other speaker, the brother from New Zealand and Australia, and after that we will have to conclude. Brother?
In summary, if you want to see a private sector or privatisation experiment, all you've got to do is look at New Zealand. In the 60s and 70s, yes, we had our problems, but we had a very good society. In 2014, we've got the most inequitable society now. I mean, we've got starting to have third world diseases that are coming in poorer societies around the country. Our major, Auckland's our biggest city. Now 3/4 of the population live there, and then also Christchurch, it's had an earthquake, so everyone's going there. So what's happening is all the other regions sort of aren't doing that well. I mean, all you've got to look at is our telecommunications. I mean, what's happened there is it's gone from private sector to providers to now dependent contractor models. It's just crazy. Then, for example, have a look at the energy sector. We've got the highest power prices. And probably, I'm not sure in the world, but I mean, people can't afford their power now. What they have to do is they've got to actually buy power for sort of a day or an hour because they can't afford it. And then, for example, now what's happening, the railways. The railways is another example where they sold off the railways. Basically, they ripped the guts out of it, left it in a state, and then the government had to buy it back. So now what I'm looking at, you know, in my 40s, from coming to growing up in a really good country, is worrying about high prices and will my children actually have houses to live in, or will I have to provide for them well into my 70s and 80s, or will they look after me? Because what they're doing is, like you say, the retirement is going out. So, you know, privatisation, the experiment that happened in the 1980s in New Zealand, all you've got to look is it's a disaster. And the thing is now we have one of the most inequitable societies in the world.
Roger?
Yes, thanks, brother. My name is Martin O'Neill. I'm from the Communication Workers Union in Australia. We represent both postal and telecommunications members, and I suppose I just want to make a couple of points about our experience over there and maybe sort of pose a question here too about a way forward potentially in the future. The privatisation of Telstra, which was a telecommunications company in Australia, you know, wasn't a great success, especially as far as regional and rural Australia are concerned. Obviously, there's a lot of similarities with Canada. There's a huge tyranny of distance being number one, and the fact that a privatised company was going to service these communities in the same way that it would if it was a publicly owned entity was farcical, and the experience replicated that. Though every cloud does have a silver lining, so with that privatisation experience, that's allowed us a lot of strong political lobbying weight when it comes to lobbying with rural politicians, because as soon as the privatisation of Australia Post is mentioned, of course, the people in regional and rural Australia have got very recent experiences of the privatisation of Telstra. They seen what that meant. They got a fair idea what the privatisation of the postal service would mean, and they are buttons that we don't hesitate to push politically. Now, just on the political issue, we've seen a rise in Australia the past 10 or 15 years of the conservative, independent, rural sort of person who stands in rural areas. Now, traditionally, they are conservative. I'm not sure whether it's a big C or a small c, but they'd be against some things such as gay marriage and abortion, I suppose, on the socially conservative things. But on the other side, they can be pretty left-wing. A lot of them are anti-free trade, vehemently anti-free trade, anti-foreign workers coming in and undermining the conditions of Australian workers. That's always a dicey one for us as a union, but we manage that as we can. So I suppose the question is in Canada now, has there been a rise of the independent, the rural independent? If not, I suggest you start getting it happening, because come the next election time, if you've got a number of these people standing on a platform of anti-privatisation and more services in Canada Post, you know, obviously while the balance of power wouldn't be achievable instantly, there's still going to be a voice in Parliament, and I think it's important to get any voice that we can in. We've made a couple of blues, we missed the boat. We should have got a candidate up and running in the recent Western Australian Senate election under the Hands Off Aussie Post banner. We could have generated a significant amount of publicity and organised around that. So I just suggest if the same opportunity affords itself here, grab it with both hands.
OK, il est midi. Donc,
it's now noon, so we can give our panelists a minute each to give a brief summary of their final ideas. And then we'll go on to the next part. John?
I would say that my main message is that postal banking is possible. It can be very successful in Canada. Right now, we lack the political will to move there, but I believe we can build up the movement which will demand that we move on postal banking. And I think that we've seen out there in the public that once people know what it is and how it could benefit from them, there will be very large public support for this measure.
I just want to quickly get in my favorite New Zealand privatization story. When the public zoo was in all kinds of financial troubles, so their response, you know, to all the cutbacks were necessary, was there was a baby hippo that was being born, so they decided, let's shoot it. You know, which is kind of like the idea that that's the way you have to deal with these deficit problems.
And where's the elephant gone?
So I would just say in my concluding remarks that, you know, I find this issue so compelling simply because it really does address this whole thing that we're getting into as we discuss privatization and the dismantling of services. I mean, your description of what has happened in New Zealand is so compelling. We've seen a taste of that here in Canada. It hasn't gotten to that level, but we already know there's lots of people pushing in that direction. And we've seen, you know, disastrous results like John referred to in Hamilton. And in fact, this is an opportunity, a wonderful opportunity to go in the other direction, to actually build something stronger in terms of a public system that would provide enormous benefits to so many people in so many different parts of the country, particularly the underserved parts of the country. I think it's an incredible opportunity for us to, you know, not be on the defensive, always trying to ward off, you know, more privatization, and go out and actually fight and make the case for an extension of our public systems into this incredibly exciting, important area. And I think it's a case, as the polls show, that Canadians are open to, and it's a simple case, it's understandable. In fact, it really is a kind of open and shut case when you start looking at the evidence. So I think if we actually really pushed it forward, I think it'd be incredibly powerful.
Pour aller dans le même sens,
to go in the same direction, I'd like to say that very often we have the impression that the arguments of the right wings are simple and obvious. But here, with the maintenance of a public service, you have an ambitious proposal. You have good arguments, simple, easy to understand arguments, something that the public can understand. And I believe that now that you have developed these arguments and that you have good studies, you have to go before the public to defend this position so that we'll all have good public services. Thank you. So I'd like to thank our three speakers. In a way, they have given us the basic arguments for us to continue this discussion, and this afternoon we'll get into specific cases of banking services elsewhere in the world. I'd like to remind you that 2/3 of the population of Canada agree with having good banking and financial services and to have them in the post office. So I'd like to thank our three speakers. We have a little gift for them to remind them of their solidarity with CUPW. So the meal is served outside these doors, and we'll take a break from 12 to 1. Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Linda. Thank you, John.